Thank you for joining us tonight, and welcome to Science World. Tonight it's a fantastic moment for me because it's 10 years of work that's come to fruition. We're bringing together Island Conservation, the organization, here at Science World with this brand new exhibit that's just been launched celebrating their work. And to help us tell the story, we've got Linda Solomon Wood from the National Observer, and unfortunately we were going to have David Beers from the Tyee, and David unfortunately has fallen ill today, so he can't join us. We wish you well, David. Tonight is a night of celebration because in these dark times and heavy headlines, the work that Island Conservation does in preventing extinctions and creating flourishes of biodiversity globally is incredibly important work. So yes, it's an exhibit launch, and yes, we're talking about the book that comes with it, but predominantly we're talking about the notion of island conservation, the verb, and island conservation, the organization. And I'm thrilled that Linda has read my book, and we're going to start right there by asking her what she actually thinks of it.
Thank you so much, Andy and Greg. It's great to be with you tonight, and hello everyone. I had the great pleasure of reading Andy's book. You know, and how it is when Andy and I have known each other for a long time, and when you have a friend produce a book, you never know what it's going to be like. And when I picked up your book, Andy, and spent some time with it, I found myself feeling amazingly uplifted, knowing the work that is going on islands, 5 islands that you went to, and how life is being restored. It was so exciting. So tell us, where did you go to make this book?
Well, it started, and I should have introduced Greg at the beginning. Gregg Howald is an island conservation alumni, and he is now the CEO of Freshwater Life. And he was with island conservation for over 20 years. And so Greg and I met in 2010, and Greg dragged me to some of these places because we found a shared passion in conservation. So the book takes you to our first adventure where we got into trouble for the first time, to Gwaii Haanas in Haida Gwaii, here in our own backyard. And subsequent to that, we ended up, and that was one of the islands, it's an archipelago in fact, that has got many issues from many invasive species. We then telescoped to the island of Palmyra, which is an island that is post-restoration and it explodes with wildlife. And then Greg says, well, you've got to see them all. And before I know it, I'm on the bomb-ravaged island of Kaho, olawe. And Kaho olawe holds so much promise, but there's a huge amount of work to be done on that island. And then we went to possible islands, like Okinoshima in the Sea of Genkai, which is halfway between Japan and South Korea. And our last island that we went to was the archipelago of the Galapagos. And in the Galapagos, you've got not only invasive species issues, but you've got humans living in this landscape at the same time. And there, the complexities of the project take off. And
when you're talking about invasive species, first of all, I just want to say that, wow, the photographs in this book are incredible. They're so beautiful. And you're seeing the islands as a photographer. But Greg, you're there as a scientist. Tell us about the invasive species. Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, the focus really is about biodiversity conservation. It is about the conservation of threatened species and recovery of threatened ecosystems. When we look at islands, they support a disproportionate amount of our global biodiversity. About 20% are found on these islands, and representing just about 5% of the Earth's surface. When we look at the historic extinction rate, we see that, again, a disproportionate amount of our extinctions that we know about have occurred on islands, upwards of 70 to 75%. And today, we see about 40% of threatened species are found on islands. When we look at the threats of those extinctions, or threats of extinctions for those species that are still extant, we see that invasive species are the major drivers of those extinction events. And for those species that are still there, that's the limiting factor. So what we have an opportunity here, because islands are whole functioning ecosystems, we know we can remove these invasive species, and ecosystems and the species within them can, and they do recover, a lot of times with very little input by people.
And what are like some of the invasive species? Like, we're talking about animals, I'm assuming that. So Andy, tell us, like, I'm looking around the walls here of Science World and seeing beautiful birds and turtles and a crab. Like, what did you see, and where was it most profound for you?
Every island has had its profound moments, but Palmyra for me was an awakening moment, and that sounds a little corny, but in Palmyra, it was the first island that I'd been to that had been fully restored and had a 10-year period to recover. And the island there was incredibly complex. It wasn't an easy island to figure out where the impacts were happening. Clearly rats were present, but there was much more going on. And you arrive at this island that's been recovered, and it just explodes with wildlife. It's, you know, you get out the plane because you've landed on this crushed coral runway. It's the most scariest landing in your life because it hasn't been maintained. So there's potholes and you're bouncing, and the noise from the aircraft is huge. And then you get out, and there's 4 of you climbing out of this small airplane, and you've just doubled the island's population of humans. And the sky is filled with birds of all different species, just alive. And it was once like that in many places around the world. And so that right there, you've got this, oh my goodness, I've never experienced this before moment. And the trip to Palmyra, where we were photo documenting and the recovery of the populations, it just every day was like that, but from something different. I mean, I talk about the crabs and all the issues around the crabs, and that's just an amazing story in itself.
Tell us about the crabs.
Well, when island conservation arrived and tried to figure out what was going on the island, there were only 3 species of crab present. But there are 10 in that ecosystem across the Line Islands. And the reality is the rats on this island feed on anything and everything. And so the littlest of crabs, the ghost crabs, they're tiny, tiny crabs, and they're see-through almost. They don't survive. They're fodder. But the coconut crabs are this size. They're vibrant in their colors, and they're super skittish. And the only way you can get photographs of them is actually lie down and become bait so that they can smell you and they then come to investigate. So you just got to keep an eye on your toes while you're looking through the lens, because they will take your fingers and toes off. And so what happened was when the rats were removed, the larvae from the surrounding islands repopulated the island. And now it's alive with 10 species of crabs.
You know, what comes up for me listening to that is the word wondrous, which I believe I was at an exhibit here some years ago that you created about the Great Bear Rainforest. How is it, why are you attracted to go off and do these? Document these.
Well, you know, you're talking to an engineer, a scientist who actually grew up dreaming of being, you know, Ansel Adams, and that wasn't in the cards, right? You know, but David Attenborough and his documentaries have been a huge part of my parents' life, my life, and my children's life. And he's a multi-generational hero. And with the success that came with building a company, the opportunity to help organizations doing these things that, as a teenager, I loved tramping around the mountains with my camera. It's almost like I'm reliving my teenage years to some degree, but at the same time being purposeful, because hopefully we have time today and we'll get to that picture as we talk about the Galapagos possibly at some point. You can do very good things with your camera for these organizations.
Well, let's start with the beginning. Like, what was the first island?
The first island was Gwaii Haanas here. It's the archipelago here in Haida Gwaii. And what attracted me to Gregg's, Gregg was giving a technical lecture and I turned up and listened. And we met around the time that I had been heavily involved in supporting the initiatives around the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement. So, you've got great folks, organizations like Raincoast Solutions Project, Raincoast Conservation Society, Canopy Planet, all those groups here have done a huge amount to move that forward. And then you can play a small role helping them. And so I was deeply familiar with what was going on in the Great Bear. But the thing about the Great Bear Rainforest is it's one of those ecosystems that we talk about globally as being intact and pristine. And it is very functional. And we use those words intact and pristine perhaps a little too easily. But without dumping into that as a big discussion point, there are very few of those big ecosystems left. And yes, we should protect all that we have there. But you realize there's way more damaged stuff than there is vibrant stuff. And so the next logical step is rewilding, bringing things back. And that's where Gregg and I resonated, and we kicked off with our first adventure in Gwaii Haanas together.
And that's so interesting because as so much of the earth is damaged and coasts, like you're really talking about, this word rewilding. Can you say more about that, maybe Gregg?
Well, we have an opportunity here. We know that in the context of the islands and the limiting factor being invasive species, we know that we can reclaim this habitat. We know that we can bring these habitats back to a point where species do have an opportunity to recover and ecosystems can restructure again. Now the thinking is moving towards looking at the way the islands can play a role in terms of moving species between islands or between islands that are under threat, where we don't have the opportunity to do some restoration work, where they're now islands of refugia, or islands that are thinking about climate change that are at risk of going underwater, such as coral atolls. There's species out there. Their species have to move somewhere at some point in the future, and looking at some of these high islands as places of refugia. So this concept of rewilding.
Wait, what is refugia?
Refugia would be a place where they have an opportunity to continue to thrive and exist because they're under threat in their historical range.
What that immediately brings us to Kaho olawe, which is this island just 8 miles south of Maui. You can't go visit it because it's covered in unexploded bombs, and it was used as a bombing range by the American military for over 50 years. But now it has to be returned to the Polynesians, and has to be returned in the state that it was taken from them. So it's a huge restoration job, and the island is desolate. Its topsoil has been completely bombed off, and the opportunity there to rewild that island, bring back first the vegetation, then bring back the species. To Gregg's point, when islands like Palmyra that are 6 feet above sea level, climate change, there are some things that are somewhat inevitable. And so we both have to try and do our best to mitigate climate change as well as adapt. And the Kaho olawe is part of the adaptations side of the equation because it's 50 feet above sea level, and it's a great place to translocate or provide habitat that these species can naturally gravitate to.
Tell us about a few peak moments from your experiences.
I'm very grateful there is quite a few. I think one of the most important ones for me is I have this adventure on Palmyra where I convinced the team, we've all gone out on a boat to one of the refugia islands at Palmyra, and it's a 2-hour rigmarole to get there because there's this huge biodiversity protection protocol in place. So we get all the way out there, and then it turns out the equipment's malfunctioned and we've got to go all the way back. And it's like, you're kidding me. You go back, I'm totally fine on my own in the middle of nowhere. I'll be fine. Well, honestly, they were out of sight 30 seconds and I'm in serious trouble. Stupid enough to see this picture and go for it, which I ended up wading into the lagoon. And on these remote atolls, the tide only goes up and down 2 feet at best. So once you get past the low water mark, which immediately you do, it's a soupy, suctionous mass out there. And I wanted the right angle on this picture, and so I'm oblivious, and I'm, basically up to my thighs in the water with my fancy camera, and I'm setting up and getting my picture. And then it's time to come back in, and I can't move. I am stuck. And it's like, oh, crap, I got to stand here for 2 hours if I'm lucky. And then, 30 seconds into it, you realize the heat is not going to last 2 hours. And so I got to get out of here. And so I ended up wriggling my feet free because it was my shoes in the mud that were causing the problem. But now I've got this camera, and and so the only way out was to crouch down in the water and become buoyant, push my camera high, float up, and then I'm underwater because the camera's 4 kilograms, right? And so I'm holding my breath, and like some demented turtle, I make my way back to the beach. But the important part of the story is not only am I an idiot, but the reality is I got to sit under a tree for 2 hours and think about stuff where I was drying out all my clothes and all the rest of it. And it was that moment where you're surrounded in this place, then this notion of the Accretocene came to mind. Now, it's something that Greg and I and Nick, what's Nick's surname?
Holmes.
Nick Holmes. Nick Holmes, one of the other lead
I don't
scientists.
think I've ever heard that word.
Well, we've made it up, so we're quite proud of our new word. So the Accretocene is the opposite of the Anthropocene. It's this period of geological time where humans take nurturing of the world and biodiversity seriously and proactively to create this flourish of biodiversity.
So it's like an aspirational time.
It is, exactly. But what came of it is, and the exhibit here, and I encourage people, and we can't show it because it's so complex, but there's the genetic tree of life right over there, and it is this most amazing diagram that shows how all the genetics of all species on Earth are truly connected. And so we often talk, and it's an old adage that we share 90% of our DNA with chimpanzees. But we're 4/5 a grizzly bear too, right? And
how's that?
Because when you look at the tree of life, the very beginnings of evolution, we share all of it. We're truly connected to everything on life, on the planet. And it's a revelation. And so we got to thinking about it, and we got to brainstorming about it, and out of it came this notion of the Accretocene that we've documented and published, thankfully, to the National Observer. And the idea is exploding because it's now already found its way into peer-reviewed science papers. Mm-hmm. So we're getting pretty pumped about the idea that a few moments on Palmyra had led to this. And then the boat returns, and I'm sitting there covered in mud underneath a tree. And Alex Wegman, chief scientist, said, it's not too bright to sit underneath coconut trees out here because they tend to fall off, right? So
Jane Goodall writes on the back of the book. Can you tell us about Jane's relationship with your book and with...
I'm very fortunate to have spent time over a decade ago now working for the Jane Goodall Institute on the board. I was an interim member for a period of time. I filled a gap. And I, luckily I had the privilege of meeting Jane in that time. And at the same time, I did a book in the Great Bear called Faltering Light, which was a campaign book. It was a bunch of essays of thought leaders and my photographs, and then 20,000 signatures that we delivered to Christy Clark's government asking them to stop the trophy hunting of bears. And so Jane wrote one of the essays and so for that book, and we became connected colleagues, for want of a better word.
Andy, I have so many more questions about the islands, but I wanted to ask you, you've really used your photography in a very kind of unique way, like the story you just told, and the work you're doing with photographing the islands. Can you just speak a little bit about how you see the camera being a gateway for you?
Well, I think the big thing is that I grew up wanting to be Ansel Adams. It just wasn't never going to happen. But post being successful with my technology company that's allowed me to do this work and give me the space and time and resources to do it, you know, rebirthed my photography as a hobby. Well, how many pictures of chocolate box pictures can you come home with and wow your friends with and feel content with? And being an engineer, we're output people, you know, purposeful people. And so this natural evolution to what I would call purposeful photography came about, and conservation photography particularly just as a resonance there. Because, you know, to fold it back to the work that, you know, island conservation are doing, it's probably some of the most important work I've tripped over, you know.
And how much would it take to really rewild the world's islands, Gregg?
Well, first we know we can do this. We know that we have an opportunity to restore these habitats and reclaim the islands and facilitate this recovery. But when we look around the world, we know there's 400 and some odd thousand islands, of which, for example, introduced rats and mice have been introduced onto roughly 90% of them. And we really need to increase the scale and the scope and the pace of these types of projects if we really want to have an impact on biodiversity. And if we really want a positive impact, we really need innovation, we really need vision at the table to really help drive this. We know that there's about 2,500 of those islands that have some of the highest biodiversity, of which about 500 can be done over the next 5 years or so. With about $4 billion, we can achieve some massive benefits for biodiversity in these island ecosystems. But the focus really needs to be a vision at a global scale and working with the local communities and governments and, well, the multinational, like in the United Nations, working together towards this agenda.
And if you were to get that $4 billion and do that work in islands around the world, what would the impact be on the world at large?
We can save in excess of about 15% of the global biodiversity that's at threat due to invasive species.
If you're able to do that on the islands.
That's correct.
And would it have an effect on other coasts? And I mean, is it?
The benefit of the removal of invasives goes way beyond the biodiversity. We know that nearshore marine ecosystems benefit from a functioning ecosystem. Andy highlighted the abundance of seabirds. Seabirds breed on these islands, exclusively on islands in part, and as a consequence what they do is they concentrate marine nutrients, and these marine nutrients leach out during rain events into the nearshore marine environment and basically fertilizer. You get this bottom-up effect. So it's not just a terrestrial impact that these invasives are having, they're actually having an impact in the marine systems. So these benefits go farther than just biodiversity, because we also know that people on these larger islands that rely on these places for their cultural well-being, their economic, and their basically for food security, that are being negatively impacted by these introduced species. So we have this opportunity to have benefits that, again, beyond biodiversity, including biodiversity and people.
And that sort of brings in the sort of simplified language of reef to ridge, or ridge to reef, that embraces the entire ecosystem. And that is on one of the islands, the Galapagos that we went to, was front and center when we were there. Now, I was there for 2 projects that are running simultaneously. The first was Timor Norte, which is this modest island of about 500 hectares, rats again present. And Gregg talks about scale and how do you do those 500 islands in a decade. Well, island conservation was the first time they were using drones. Most of this work is done with helicopters, crazy expensive, difficult to get to and fly helicopters in the middle of nowhere. But we were using drones for the first time that substantially reduced the cost. So we can do more that way.
That's so interesting.
But the second project is where it gets really interesting, is Floriana, which is one to come. And Floriana supports a subsistence farming community. And so now you've got this intersection of biodiversity recovery and human well-being. And the work is important because it builds towards the 17 goals, the strategic development goals of the United Nations. And there's a picture of how critical this work is. There's some picture, and it comes back to your question about purposeful photography and that discussion. The picture is Claudio and Victor in a food storage locker on the Galapagos, And the maize was meant for human consumption, but it's been totally spoilt by an infestation of rats on it. And so that island has issues with the the Darwin finches being attacked by the cats and the rats on that island. And here's the food source also being, for humans being, and so that one picture, it's a simple picture, it's a straightforward picture, but that picture was so powerful because it brought organizations that have human well-being as their focus, philanthropic organizations where improving human well-being is their core mandate, to appreciate that it's the same as biodiversity. These things are coupled, both natural security and cultural security come together in a joint symbiotic kind of need.
Thank you, Andy. We have some really great questions from the audience. What invasive animals are you talking about? How did they get there, and what impact do they have? Let's start with what invasive animals are you talking about?
How about we go A, B, A, B, A, B?
Yeah.
So I pick rats.
Well, the top three that we typically see are the mammals, the rats and mice, and the cats, the predators, and the invasive ungulates like goats. The introduction events can go back thousands of years. We know, for example, with rats, the introduction event started with the Polynesians that moved out into the Pacific, followed by some of the European events that we well know about, and it continues today. There's introduction events that continue. Some of them are inadvertent, some of them are deliberate. In some of these deliberate ones, for example, they introduced ungulates. It was not uncommon actually for pirates or for some of the explorers to, as they were moving around, or the whalers as they were moving around, to deposit goats and or feral pigs onto these islands because of their ability to survive in these ecosystems. They could come back and harvest for food. So that was not, it's quite a common event.
Well, how do you eliminate them? Like how?
The specifics of how, yes. Well, again, we know because these islands are whole functioning ecosystems, we know that we can remove them. In the case of rats and mice, the typical approach involves the use of rodenticide. It's a very strategic, very precise, professional application of rodenticide. And it can be really difficult to remove introduced rodents 100% of a population. And how do you do it without making the rodenticide available to other species? And that is where the trick with these types of projects comes into play, and where my background and expertise as an ecotoxicologist, how I got started is, again, how do you remove all the rats and mice from the island while minimizing that potential risk to the native species on the island? How do you balance that? At the end of the day, through a series of research that takes many, many years, I think, Andy, you highlighted earlier, some of these projects take many years of research to understand the ecosystem, when to apply, what mitigation strategies you need to minimize those risks. And then again, the decision is not up to us, it's up to the communities, the governments, to really weigh the risks of the action against the long-term benefits. But we know that in the context of these invasives, what we have is a situation where we're talking about leaving the invasives on the island, and we're destined for an extinction event, or we have an opportunity to remove these invasives and allow these threatened species to recover.
And an extinction event would be like for many species or one species? Is it like kind of the rats against one species or against many species?
It's against many. In the context, rats are one of the major drivers of extinctions that we're seeing on islands. They're responsible for about half of all bird and reptile extinctions. And again, Palmyra is a perfect example of sometimes we don't even know the impacts that these invasives are having in the ecosystem. For example, on Palmyra, we saw within 6 weeks of the removal of rats from the island, the forest floor popped, literally popped in places with the seedlings of the native Pisonia tree. We didn't even know that rats were having an impact on the native Pisonia at all at the time, because there was the abundance of rats. There was no evidence to suggest that that would happen. So there's a saying we have is, be prepared to be surprised once these removals occur, because these ecosystems start to recover quickly and dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Andy?
Well, that's one of the things that I got very excited about on the first trip to Gwaii Haanas, because you worry about, maybe there's a poisoned rat carcass that's going to impact an eagle that might eat it? Well, first of all, the first thing is the rodenticide forces the animals to go back to their nests. They're feeling squiffy before they die. So most of them die underground. But the research had shown that, hey, we can tease the eagles off. And so I was going on this trip thinking I'm going to see hundreds of eagles up there. There's none. And it's only on the return trip that found out that part of the strategy was 2 islands over, the local fish cannery had been recruited to dump all the latest waste from the fish processing plant here. And every eagle worth his salt for 200 miles around was just sitting on the island, not having to work for a living for that week. And it's so very clever strategies, and that's what comes. Then they're simple, but it takes work to figure them out for each ecosystem. And that for me is one of the favorites, because there was suddenly this island full of eagles miles away from where they could have been in trouble, right? You know.
This is another question from the audience. Do you practice compassionate conservation? How do you relieve the suffering of the animals that are killed?
That's a fair question, and I understand the intent here. I think where I come from and my colleagues come from, we're biologists and we're caring at heart. The reality is we're not choosing to do this because we want to do the removal of invasives from an island. We're doing it because we have to. Globally we're facing this dilemma. Do we allow these extinctions to happen on our watch? Species, once they're gone, versus removing the invasive when we have an opportunity to recover that threatened species. And that's the dilemma that we're facing. So it's not a choice of wanting to do this, it's a choice of preventing extinctions or allowing these invasives in these ecosystems. We know they have their historical range, they're doing just fine.
Yeah, so it's like as humans, we brought in these species like goats, rats, cats, dogs,
Feral pigs.
Pigs. And they eat native species and they destroy the local habitats. And so as humans, we're again faced with making a choice of, do we want these islands just to be dominated completely by these species?
Correct.
Or do we want to have a more biodiverse situation on the islands? Is
that's ultimately the choice.
But the important distinction is when you let places go to become mono species, the ultimate, there's only the rats left. The range of impacts in terms of into the ocean are huge. You're not just letting the species you can see on the island, it's all the associated species underneath in their reefs too. And so the knock-on effects are huge. And ultimately, we're part of that trophic chain.
You showed me a picture, I think, or you were talking about when we were talking before this, Andy, on the island that was bombed. You showed me the part that was rewilded.
Yeah.
And then you showed me the other part, and you said that there was going to be a lot of runoff into the ocean from
So Kaho
the
olawe,
part that was just what, like mud or?
Yeah, totally. Like Kaho olawe has got so little vegetation on it that when it rains, the runoff is brown. You can see the rivers coming over the cliff edges on Kaho when it rains, and the ocean then becomes silted. So all your reefs struggle, all the fish struggle because you've got high sediment loads in the gills. All the turtles struggle, and so it's a knock-on effect that we can prevent that happening if we get the regrowth going on the island. But I'd like to add to one of the things you might have forgotten about is on Gwaii Haanas, we actually had the Humane Society come up and actually audit the process, and they gave us the gold seal of what we were doing at the time up there. I say we, Island Conservation, gave us the gold seal because when we were on Okinoshima, for instance, when we did live trapping on Okinoshima to find out what species of rats were present, and we euthanized one of the rats so we could do the DNA studies. That was a very difficult moment because Massa, who led the team, is a devout Shinto religious person where all life is regarded as sacred. And we are in this island that was regarded as a Shimanwara, a sacred space where all life was sacred. And here we were, euthanizing an ant. He was visibly upset. And so I've seen all the team members take it. It's a very serious moment, and so I'm proud to be part of it because, in some small way. because it is taken seriously, and we're dealing with very important questions here that are hard questions, you know.
Yeah, they're really like deep moral issues.
Yeah, totally, right.
And that get kind of to the core of who we are as a species ourselves.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think there's a passage in I know there's a passage, can't remember my exact words, but, you know, you could be argued that we're playing God here, right? But the reality is we do that all day, every day through our everyday actions. We just do it badly because we don't think about the consequences. I would like to say that on these islands where you've got these creatures that are going extinct, that reflect the beauty and the wildness of the world, this good work protects all of that. And we have to play God, but perhaps we could do it just a bit better than we're used to doing, right? Yeah. Right.
I agree, and I think that in the context of that question around compassionate conservation, you know, one of the way we sort of view this is we use the appropriate tool for the job to remove the invasives. And if there is a better tool that's out there that is more humane, that still maintains the efficacy, that the efficiency that we're looking for, then absolutely we would adopt that tool. We'd be the first ones in line to use it, as a matter of fact. A few years ago, we ended up in a conversation with the animal welfare community around this, about the work that we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and we came together with the International Humane Societies, and there is a paper that's published actually out of British Columbia SPCA as a lead. Sarah Dubois is on ethical principles of vertebrate wildlife control. And we were freely and contributing to that dialogue at the time.
Wow, those are hard issues. What role can an average person play, like in rewilding the world?
You can do a lot. Planting trees is a huge deal, big deal, both on the global warming front and on creating habitat. And you can also, there's lots of projects locally. We're removing invasive plants, which is a big deal. And here on our local islands, Sydney, isn't it? We're doing Sydney Island, the invasive deer that were introduced on much of the local, those projects need lots of support. So there is a lot in the locale that you could go do.
Yeah, and you know, also thinking about the long-term protection of these investments that are being made in these islands, and thinking about biosecurity. We're moving around the Gulf Islands here in BC, or up in moving with the ferry systems. We're moving people and goods. We're maybe inadvertently transporting invasives to these islands. And people on their day-to-day activities should think about how they're possibly contributing. Take a look under the hood. Take a look at what you're transporting in your shoes, through like seeds sticking to your shoelaces, those sorts of things. Because we have an opportunity, once these projects are done, to protect that investment in perpetuity.
Well, what are the ramifications of bringing, inadvertently bringing an invasive species to a new island?
So I'm going to jump there because they're going to jump straight in, because we saw this small movie at the beginning tonight. The impact is huge because New Zealand, as a massive island and a massive archipelago, has got a national program to eliminate all invasives from the New Zealand country writ large. You can stop a truck driver in New Zealand and they know all about this stuff and they're all on board. But the reason I'm jumping in is to let the audience know that as we close tonight, we have the $1 Million Mouse Project, which is out of New Zealand. It's a 20-minute, it's a fabulous documentary. So for those who can stick around, please stick around, because we should have mentioned that at the beginning. And sorry to jump in, but it just reminded me we've got to do that. So,
that's exciting. And what role can tourism play?
Oh, tourism can play a big role. To Gregg's point, I've had the privilege of, going up the coast with a few of our local ecotourism operators, and you're loading people on boats, you're loading people and food on boats, and wherever people move, rats in particular and house mice come along. So it doesn't take too much to check that you haven't brought a stowaway aboard, right? That's a big deal, right? My belief is that ecotourism is a mainstay of this coast now, in particular here locally and globally, but here locally. It's a serious opportunity to think about these things and then go act accordingly.
Well, This has been such an interesting conversation. We're coming to the end of our time before we're going to show the film, and I just wanted to remind everybody that we're here to talk about this quite amazing book called The Pelican's Paradise that deals with this, preventing extinctions and rewilding islands, and is just, I hope that people will consider taking a look at it, sharing it. You can get it as an ebook, right, Andy?
So, shall I close up?
Yeah.
So, the book and the exhibit are predominantly an awareness exercise. You can buy the book online, and it's both an ebook and the hard copy book. As a photographer, I'd love every home in Vancouver to have a hard copy on their coffee table, but that's a little egotistical. I'd encourage you to buy the ebook because it has a 0 footprint and it's an awful lot cheaper. The book is printed on Forest's sustainable style.
Guess what?
Plus,
I just got a note that says we should keep going for 15 more minutes.
All right, okay.
So, pivot.
So I'm going to finish the book bit and then we'll go carry on for 15.
All right.
So the book is a multi-level fundraiser, and so it's a little complicated, so hang on. So we donated 100 books to Science World, the hard copies. If you come and buy them here, the money goes 100% to the operations of Science World, which is this fantastic organization that does so much more, especially in early ed science education for the local community schools. If you buy it, it will be matched, and the same funds will be matched and sent to island conservation. And if you buy it online on the ebooks, both the Tyee and the National Observer that have been phenomenal over the years carrying these stories will benefit their operations from that. So please think about all of that when you reflect after this evening.
Now back to our conversation. So there's so much adventure in this book. And when I hear you talk about what you do, Gregg, I just am like, wow, what a life you have. So, it's such an amazing mixture of both the science and the, seeing the world and doing something purposeful for the world. Mm-hmm. Andy, does that resonate?
Oh, totally. Right? I get a tiptoe into Gregg's world, right? But when you listen...
Why did you tag on? What was it about Gregg that captured your imagination?
So, am I honest? The reality is, well, I don't know what the reality is. We were at Tides Canada in 2010. Tides Canada, which is now Makeway, was supporting island conservation, and it was an awareness evening. And it's just, oh my God, I got to get. Well, I self-referenced. I came out the crowd and said to Gregg, how can I help? These are what I got to offer. So one of the things I do that I think is important is when I tag along on one of these expeditions, I only go if there's a spare spot. In other words, there's not a sign. Invariably the plane can only take so many people in. Getting to these places is incredibly difficult. And so whether it's a vessel or a plane, it's always weight limited, people limited. So I only go if for some reason there's a spare spot or a scientist has dropped out at the last minute unexpectedly or whatever, so the slot's not wasted. And then in addition to taking pictures, I'll clean toilets, cook food, carry gear, just pay my ways, so to speak, and it's an adventure. Why would you not sign up?
Yeah. If I may pull you guys back to the science and to the actually what you're doing on the islands, another question from the audience. Mm-hmm. What's different about rodenticide than what we might understand in terms of domestic applications? So
we can dig deep into that. There's two things. One, I will refer to the rodenticide is very similar to what you could have bought previously prior to the legislation that's in BC here. You could have bought off the shelf in a hardware store. It was the design of the product that we had designed in the conservation context that was designed specifically for use in an island context. In an urban setting, you're talking about population control. You're talking about a reduction or removal of rats from out of your home or out of a neighborhood, but inevitably they're going to make their way back. In the context of the islands, we're talking about removing 100% the eradication of introduced rodents. And the only way we know how to do it is through the delivery of a bait containing a rodenticide. Typically, the anticoagulants is the technical, anticoagulant rodenticide is the technical category they're in, delivered into every potential rodent territory on the island. And doing it in such a way that minimizes the risks to those other species.
Let's talk about that.
Let's just quickly, because one of the fun facts is around all that I was kind of blown away is in that 4-year research window, you do this live trapping to find out exactly what species of rats. So if you've got tree rats or ground rats or black rats, they all respond to bait in a different way. And so in the case of tree rats, you have to construct bait that gets caught in the trees. And so there's a huge technical component. If it's on a tropical island, does it just get washed away instantly in the daily rains? You know, so it becomes quite a carefully targeted, and that's, you know,
that's
critical.
really interesting. So the topic of rodenticide is really hot in the chat that's happening. Okay, so everybody's talking about it. So let's dig in deeper. So tell us about the impact of. Wait, hang on a second. Well, tell us about the impact of rats on the ecosystem, like of the rodenticide. Like, how does it actually affect them? And give us specific examples from the field. You've already done that a little bit, but if you could unpack it a bit more.
Well, the rodenticides are, the anticoagulants are one of the major benefits from an efficacy perspective, and making sure that we have a reasonable chance of getting 100% is that there's a delayed onset of symptoms. So the animal ingests the rodenticide, there's a period of time, and then they're maintaining a normal lifestyle, and then they're starting to feel the symptoms, and they'll end up most of them die underground in their burrows. That's what we know.
Okay, so this is the critical question I think people don't quite yet understand. Why is it so important to kill the rats?
Well, first of all, what are you going to do with the rats if we live trap them? Again, we're talking about the restoration of the habitat. We're talking about one of the major drivers of species extinctions on islands are rats. That's just the bottom line. It's one of the major invasives that we see on these islands. And they are driving birds, plants, invertebrates, amphibians, and reptiles to extinction. That's a proven fact.
How did they do it? How do they do it? Like, what do they actually do to this?
It's horrific.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
And so I know we've got young people listening because I've got friends tuned in, so I'm not going to go into the graphic details, but the video from the cameras, particularly of seabirds and seabird chicks on the nests, being strategically targeted by rats is just unsettling. Even as an adult who's watched, you know, shoot 'em up movies, it is unsettling to watch how these creatures that have evolved on these islands, and this is the tricky bit, they've evolved without any defense mechanisms because they've been predator free all their lives or all their existence. And so it's quite horrific in terms of the impact on the predated species. And then the second and very important thing is that...
So they basically eat them.
Oh yeah, alive.
This is...
Right, and they eat them alive. And
they go and they hunt other... So they're predators.
Yeah,
they are very efficient predators.
On species that have lived without predators.
And they've got no natural instincts to fight them, right?
So they don't... So the rats just overtake those species.
Yeah.
And... how do you work with local communities on this? Do they have a say in what's happening?
Oh, absolutely. So if there's a picture of the Galapagos, I'll come back to the one with the maize, for instance. So the Galapagos is a fantastic story on the island of Floriana. And it's like, I spent 2 weeks up to my ankles in chicken poop and cow manure, taking photographs of people's subsistence farming and understanding that community. It's one of the richest experiences I've had in my life. I was so welcomed by this community. But this is a community that gets all its drinking water from one unique tiny little source on the island. all their food is grown, and so the thought of of poison coming in and rodenticide coming into their food chain was horrific. And so there's no way that they were going to allow this. And as Gregg said at the very, very beginning of our conversations tonight, that we work with the community and the local governments, and it becomes a very collegiate endeavor going forward. The community in Floriana immediately pushed back on the worries. They might be lay people in terms of the scientific literature, but like all people, they're smart, right? And they knew exactly that we don't want this environment. And so through conversations and explorations on trying to figure out a solution that would work in the area, one of the most amazing stories emerges is that when you have that picture of the maize being overrun, the farmers actually were using rodenticide, but they were using it sporadically as a last ditch.
They're just trying to do it themselves.
Chronically.
Yeah,
Versus
as anybody would.
So what came out of it was this burst of creativity. And so the solution was every farmer and every person who needs one gets a shipping container because they're rat proof. And now you can store food, and then of course being creative people, they make silage in them now, they store concrete in them, and even the local tienda store lady can bring in more rice before it gets spoiled by rats because she can store it. So then there's storage, and then water systems came into place. And so storage, water systems, and chicken coops were all engineered to be protected from bait application. So we're now hopeful, with the community's blessing, that in 2022, 2023, the island can be eradicated and they will be rat-free forever, which means their production of food will go through the roof, food security comes, and it's a win-win all around. You know?
And no more rodenticides.
Yeah.
Once it's done, it's done.
Well, I think, I'm assuming that you're invited into the islands. You're not just showing up. You come at the invitation of a government or of a local community.
At the end of the day, these projects belong to the community. It's their project.
Okay, well, following the removal of invasive species from the islands, what are other actions that can be taken to protect biodiversity? Mm-hmm. So outside of removal, are there other actions?
Yeah, the focus is on protecting that investment once it's done. We call it biosecurity. It's preventing the reinvasion, inadvertent reintroduction, people transporting, being vigilant. Basically, there is a culture change because once the action is done, there's a big investment of time into effort. There's a little bit of ecological cost through if you're talking about rodenticide use, and you need to protect that investment into the future in some cases. Other places, the islands are so remote, there's not a hope anything is ever going to get back there unless there is a shipwreck or something like that. But in other places, there is a potential, particularly where there's people that are coming and going. Mm-hmm. And so these biosecurity actions become really important into the long term, into the future. Mm-hmm. And that's just representing one.
I want to just show a couple of pictures, and I know we haven't got them queued up, but I don't know whether Ethan there can dial in. But on the left here, you see a picture of Maui, where there's these conservation fences have been put in place, and sorry, you're right. Sorry, conservation fences have been put in place, and the wild pigs, deer, and axis deer and goats have been eliminated from these areas, and the tropical forest rebirths and explodes, and you can see the difference between where it's browsed and where it's not. And this is some of the worst places on Maui where even the topsoil is now being lost because the impact is so huge. So you can have a phenomenal, in your community, this is a huge difference that can be achieved, right? And then once you've got it, making sure it doesn't fall back is a huge deal.
What haven't we covered?
We've been around the world. Where are we now? Let's have a quick look at the pictures here.
Well, I want to say something about the photos, is that, after 10 years and having been with Andy on these places and sending him to some of these other places and conversation, this photography has, going through the book in its development, really captured my imagination again, because when we're on the ground, we're heads down, we're toiling away, dealing with issues, doing research or working with the communities, really up to our knees in the mud. And these photos really kind of captured the spirit of why we're doing it. And that's something I really appreciated this book and the photos that are in it.
And that's something that I was really touched by, just a bit the bromance here going, was that I brought Gregg in, and we actually hadn't planned this event at that time. And we kind of, okay, well, maybe keep fingers crossed we can have a book launch in the classic manner if COVID lifts. And Gregg was blown away and quite moved, because his whole career is since university, is on these walls. And when he said that, this is my whole career here. I thought, right, we're going big time, and let's see what we can pull together. And then David, who's sadly not with us tonight, it was his idea. He said, well, we've got to do a joint thing with the National Observer, and it just kept, and here we are, just kept snowballing. So, yeah.
So in our last few minutes together, you guys have been, and you've told us about 5 islands where rewilding is taking place, where some really big moral issues are unfolding, life and death choices, invasive species and their lives versus, the lives of other species that have been on the planet for years, thousands of years, without having predators, evolving, and these invasive species are introduced by humans, and like so many other things humans have done that has had ramifications, so many unexpected ramifications. Looking forward for the next decades, how do you see, are you hopeful about the future and what will unfold?
I am. Again, this is a proven conservation tool. There's a lot of work that's left to be done. And what I'm really excited about is not only just the strict biodiversity benefits, but now we're seeing the linkage to the people and the people that will benefit from these types of actions. And it's prompting conversations in different places, in school curriculums, university curriculums, the legal system, really about what we're doing, and industries sitting up and taking notice. And it's generating opportunities for businesses to get involved, for governments to do things differently, thinking about our investments in the future, where there's more permanence behind our investments in biodiversity conservation.
And I'll riff on that, because this is a small pocket of human endeavor. But if you look at human endeavor since the beginning of time, it's always up and to the right. And we have some bumpy roads in that time, but we do go up and to the right. I believe that we'll, champion climate change. We're a bit slow to the party, but we're going to get there, and I'm optimistic about that. And one of the small things that drives me to be optimistic is, in the Galapagos, for the first time ever, island conservation with Envico Technologies in New Zealand championed using drones to reduce cost and possibly accelerate the scale time that we can deal with these islands. But Envico Technologies has now gone on to take their drone and do wide-scale tree planting of forests. So now we've got multiple drone companies out there actually do this, but Envico have got a particularly nice solution, born of the work that had nothing to do with planting trees, but we now can plant forests incredibly fast, and that is a huge deal. Right?
That is so exciting, and it's been wonderful to hear about your project together and the book, Andy. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and it's been wonderful to talk with you both. Andy, would you like to wrap things up?
I would, and I would like to wrap it up by saying a big shout out to 5 young people who I know are watching tonight. Tavian, Gianluca, Gianna, Gavin and Gabriella, you're all young people, and I'm thrilled that you're watching tonight, and I hope that we've excited you about the world that you'll inherit from us.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is the first Conversations of the year, and we have a lot more planned. See you next time.